Well, good morning. Like Jesse said, my name is Robert Hettinger, and I'll be sharing my testimony with you this morning. So, I grew up in Mitchell, South Dakota. I have one sister, and we were raised by our mother. My dad passed away when I was 6 due to drinking and driving. And by that point in my life, my parents had already been divorced for a couple years, and my mom would remarry a couple years after that. However, that also ended in divorce by the time I was 12. Growing up, we were raised to believe in God, but we would, it was a very occasional trip to church. We were always the first to leave, and we didn't take part in anything, that any sort of church function that they would have. It was just kind of a box that was checked. We had no understanding, or at least I had no understanding of who Jesus is, and what he has for me at an early age. And so growing up, my mom worked very hard to provide for us. She worked a lot, and that allowed me a lot of free time, which I used to get in trouble. I just rebelled. I didn't have anybody to really rein that in, and so with that, I also sought friends that lived the same way. And so it was just a lot of getting into trouble at an early age, and then at the age of 12, my friends and I were at the annual Corn Palace Festival in Mitchell, and the gentleman always had a tent set up. I always remember seeing his tent, but he was in there painting faces, and it was a guy from a local church. And just remember that year, I was drawn to it, and so I grabbed my buddy's arm and pulled him into the tent with me, and we sat down. And as we got our faces painted, he told us about the good news of Jesus Christ and what he has done for us if we choose to believe in him. And I accepted Christ into my life that day. And I remember leaving that tent just kind of still a lot of questions. I mean, I didn't really know where to go from there, and I didn't have anybody to help me in that walk either. So I continued on in my sin. In my teenage years, my 20s and early 30s, I was full of sin. I suffered a lot from addiction, whether it was nicotine or drinking or drugs. I just was immersed in it. And then in 2006, I met Rachel, my wife. Met at a bar of all places. And she was living a very similar lifestyle to what I was living in at the time. And so we'd been dating for a couple years, and her parents, who are wonderful people, grounded in their faith, told us about a small church that was just getting started up, just a couple blocks from the apartment I was living in Sioux Falls. And so we started going, and we started making some friends and attending regularly. But we were both living in our sin still. But as we plugged in more and started joining some Bible studies and volunteering, that sort of thing, Rachel turned from her sin. It was pretty immediate. But I remained with the same group of friends that I always had. I mean, that was kind of the lifestyle I knew and I was used to, and so I remained in my sin. And then in 2009, I started getting bloody noses out of nowhere. I wouldn't go away, and kind of just kept pushing it off. And after about a week, Rachel finally knocked some sense into me, told me to go and get it checked out, and I didn't leave the hospital for about 39 days. I was told I had leukemia. And it was crazy because that time spent in the hospital, I never worried about the outcome. And I was filled with joy during it. One of the small groups that Rachel and I had joined at Embrace consisted of a group of people that just thrive, surrounding us with love during that time. And I was just filled with courage and hope throughout that. And so, just as quick as I was diagnosed with it, I was told I was in remission. And later that year, in 2009, I married Rachel, and I also started going back to school. And unfortunately, I returned to my sin. I went back to hanging out with the same friends that I always had, and not that that was on them whatsoever, but it was something I neglected to remove myself from. I knew what sin awaited me in that situation, and I just chose not to go the other direction. And it really wasn't until one night I was out of town with some friends, and I was drinking, and I intended to come home that night, and Rachel was at home with our newborn baby. And I ended up drinking so much I didn't come home that night. And when I got home the next day and I saw the pain in her eyes and the betrayal that she felt, it was finally enough to wake me up. And nowhere near where I want to be today, but God continues to sanctify me every single day, where my desire is to glorify Him through the life that I live and just to be a servant to Him. So, thank you for listening.